This is TWiT.
I'm just going to say a caveat up front. While we occasionally get political on all of our shows, we're not here to be political. We're not here to flog a political viewpoint. But more and more recently, over the last 5 years for sure, there's been an intersection between politics and technology, and it's hard to avoid that, especially because this was the week that the President of the United States got himself banned on Twitter, Facebook, Spotify, YouTube, even Pinterest and TikTok for inflammatory comments. And I guess the first thing I would like to ask all three of you. I mean, I think that there's probably no question that when anybody, president or not, says things that incite violence and really cause problems, that it's not unreasonable to censure them in some way. And Twitter's done that with warning messages and now completely banning the president. But it also raises, in some people's minds, the specter of big tech suddenly weighing in on political issues. And it really brings home the power big tech has. We saw stories that the president's press people were casting around, where can we put his videos? There's nowhere we could put his videos. And maybe they were looking perhaps at conservative alternatives like Gab and Parler, but even those alternatives are slowly being shut down. Both Gab and Parler were under threat. Parler ended up being pulled from the Google App Store first and then later from the Apple App Store, which, by the way, caused it to be the #1 app as hundreds of thousands of people downloaded it quickly before it got banned. And now the latest is at midnight tonight Pacific time. Amazon Web Services says we're going to pull Parler down because there's too many posts like the one that says, let's all kill the vice president. We don't feel right serving that. So let me start with you, Alex, because you cover big technology. This is something big technology has resisted, but all the resistance was over after Wednesday. What's your take on that?
Well, look, there's a reason why they resisted this. They knew that if they were going to make this move, they were going to form a good amount of antitrust sentiment in the House and the Senate in a way that they hadn't previously, and they were already on the hot seat, for being mildly interventionist, not taking action like removing the president's Twitter account.
Yeah.
And I think what they're looking at right now is something pretty serious for their business, which is that you have the House Democrats and the Senate who basically got turned onto antitrust after the 2016 election, where they felt that big tech had too much power and blamed it for the election of Donald Trump and had taken antitrust investigations against big tech very seriously. I mean, really looking deeply into this stuff and getting further than Congress had ever gotten before. So you already had that brewing with congressional Democrats. Now you're going to have them joined with a group of Republicans who are furious over what's happened. And they knew that this would happen, and that's why they resisted it. That's why you saw moments where Trump would say, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, or any other form of, attempts to delegitimize the 2020 election. They let that slide. It was only until this moment where they realized it would be, basically impossible for them to face their employees and to face their board if they allowed him to stay on. They waited until this moment. So it was almost as if their hand was forced at the very last minute here. They obviously took action to ban him. Facebook might let him back on. But I think ultimately what the result of this is a very strong bipartisan push for serious new antitrust legislation that's going to come for these companies.
And yet I don't think anybody disputes that if somebody is advocating violence, particularly the violent takeover of Congress, that's something that should not be permitted on these things, right, Dan? I mean, this is very challenging. Mike Masnick wrote a really interesting piece. His headline, "Not easy, not unreasonable, not censorship. The decision to ban Trump from Twitter." which, the problem is the goalposts are constantly moving.
Yeah. Well, Twitter had, for a long time, what we might call the presidential exception to the rules. Basically, he's the president, so we're going to let him break the rules.
Which is not unreasonable.
And you can make a case. And I had been assuming that on January 20th, we were going to learn about a new ex-presidential exception. But Twitter, for its own reasons, and they're a private company, they can do what they want. That is to say, they're not the government. And it's certainly justifiable on many grounds that they said enough is enough and stopped it. The issue, and what Alex was talking about, is really relevant. This is my question, and while I certainly agree that the companies have the right to edit, to manage their spaces any way they want, the question I have is, do we really want a small number of giant enterprises to decide what is allowed in the way of speech in the United States in the giant public square we call the internet? And they do more than not make those decisions. I worry a lot about the consequences of the brigade of do something people who have been screaming at platforms to do something about all this. And when they get their way, they may in the long run wonder why they wanted quite that much intervention. We're not thinking this stuff through, and I'm quite worried about it.
I mean, it's not as if the president of the United States doesn't have. It's a bully pulpit, as Teddy Roosevelt said. He has plenty of ways he can express his opinion. There's a lot of conservative talk radio. There are conservative television networks. There are plenty of places he can tell the world what he thinks. I had mixed feelings too, because at least when he's tweeting, that gives you some insight into what his thinking is and what he's planning and what he's up to. Mm-hmm. In some ways, going dark on the president at this point is a scary thought, not a reassuring thought. And yet at the same time, I think it's completely reasonable if you're a social network to say, yeah, but you can't incite violence. There are certain things even the president can't do. And the violent overthrow of the American government is definitely in that category. Amy, what do you think?
I have a lot of thoughts.
I bet you do. We all do, obviously.
I do. Let me start, because I think disclosures in my case are important, by saying I am politically independent. We do quite a bit of work with different federal government agencies and with the military, and obviously with lots of other different companies. So with that being said, so Alex mentioned the antitrust enthusiasm in the wake of the 2016 elections, and it actually predates that. So Elizabeth Warren and some others have been charging now for years that our big tech companies have amassed a considerable amount of power and wield tremendous influence. If this was an ecosystem in the natural world, we would relate the big tech companies to a keystone species, meaning that these companies have outsized influence now on the places in which they operate, and the things that they do have serious consequences and reverberations. So as I see it, we have three core problems related to what happened last week, and they're all tech related. So the first core problem, Dan mentioned we've got a relatively small group of people who are making decisions for all of us, and that is true. That group of people is based in the Valley. We also have a small group of people in Washington, D.C. making decisions that impact all of us, and that's the Supreme Court. There's a tension inherent between the decisions that are being made in response to the evolving nature of our technology, speech, and society by the technology companies, and the static laws of the United States, laws that are not intended to change. There's this tension between the two. And resolving that tension, I think, is not just critical to get through where we are right now, but it's going to have to be the cornerstone of how law evolves over the next couple of years. Because if that doesn't happen, then the mechanisms by which we make a lot of decisions no longer make sense. So part of what's happening right now is an indiscriminate use of terms of service. The big long post that Zuckerberg relayed, the letter from Twitter, what they are doing is trying to make legalistic arguments having to do with the terms of service. And the problem is that there was a study from Carnegie Mellon a couple of years ago showing that if we stopped to read all of the terms of service that are presented to us, it would take 76 work days, so 8 hours a day, or 15 work weeks, because the median length of privacy policies is around 2,500 words. Now, if you stop, and that's just, so if you assume that you are reading the TOS and you're thinking about what you are agreeing to, right? You could even go further and show that, in terms of work lost in exchange for us reading all of these terms of service, it's like hundreds of billions of dollars. And my point is that tech companies are making up the interpretations of these terms of service as they go along, which is in conflict with the laws that they are intended to respond to. Indiscriminate application of terms of service to some extent is how we got to now. And ultimately, that's what took some of these key figures off of the networks. But in some way, they don't matter, because it's not just Trump who is the problem here. It's algorithmic determinism. It's the systems that are designed to pull content not just from him, but now from all of these other places. So Trump may be gone and AWS may have taken Parler offline, but the problem is the infrastructure supporting all of this. And I will say one last thing, and that has to do with world building, because all of this reached a sort of fever pitch in the past couple of days. And again, I say this as somebody who's politically independent. The people surrounding Donald Trump have done a masterful job of world building. They created something called Antifa. They created something called QAnon, which may have been bubbling up here and there, may have had little fits and spurts, but
certainly if they didn't create it, they certainly fostered it.
This Antifa, first of all, it makes me crazy that the way that it's being pronounced is Antifa. There is no long E sound in the word Antifa, but whatever. The point is that
it's short for anti-fascist. Antifa.
Whatever.
It doesn't matter. It's made up anyway.
But here's why it does matter, because I was at the State Department in 2012 through 2016. As were others, talking about intentional misinformation and how this has significant next order outcomes. And it would be good to red team some of this in advance to think these things through. And it just, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So we really have to think hard, because just taking some of these people offline and taking Parler and Gab, out of the Play Store, there are mirror sites already. Like, somebody created a mirror site of a subreddit that had gotten taken down. That this doesn't.
It's virtually impossible to eliminate this stuff.
That's right. So anyhow, we have three core problems that are unfortunately, from my vantage point, not going away. And the compounding effect here is that we've got a transition of power. It's cold in a lot of places where Americans live, and we have no holidays to look forward to.
January's always sucks. So
I mean, but this tells us, and we've got COVID. That's So we have to really think through not just what happened last week in a vacuum, but also how does the mechanisms that we have to deal with some of this no longer make sense.